The wild gives no second chances. From a Kodiak bear smashing into a cabin at 4 a.m. to a charging bison tossing a hunter across the rocks. From a foggy Montana ambush by a black bear to a Russian grizzly dragging a man underwater. And from a moose breaking ice in Quebec to wolves circling an injured hunter in the Yukon. These stories prove how fast the hunt can turn into survival. Watch till the end, because nature's fury strikes without warning. On September 12, 2025, the air outside a remote cabin on Kodiak Island was thick with mist, and the surrounding forest lay silent, except for the steady rush of a nearby salmon stream. Inside the modest wooden shelter, Ryan Matthews rested after a long day of scouting along the riverbanks with his 12-year-old son, Ethan. Ryan was an experienced outdoorsman, a man who had hunted and guided in Alaska for many years. He carried the kind of calm discipline that comes from knowing the wilderness both as a place of beauty and danger. His trips into the backcountry were never careless, and the small cabin had been carefully stocked with food stored in containers designed to mask scent. But in the wilderness of Kodiak, even the best preparation could be tested. Ryan's life had always been tied to the outdoors. He had grown up in a family where time spent on rivers and mountains was a way of life. Over time, he learned that the Kodiak bear was unlike any other predator in the world. Larger, faster, and stronger than nearly anything else in nature, these giants demanded respect. He had raised Ethan with those same values, teaching him to watch carefully, move quietly, and understand the signs of the land. Their trip to the island that autumn was meant as both a bonding experience and a lesson for Ethan. But what happened that night would leave scars deeper than either of them could have imagined. The evening had passed quietly. A meal of fish had been cooked, sealed, and stored in the containers meant to reduce risk. The cabin creaked lightly as the wind brushed across its sides, but the night remained uneventful until the early hours. At 4 a.m, Ryan's eyes opened to a sound no one wants to hear in the wilderness, the splintering crack of wood under crushing weight. The porch groaned, the frame of the cabin shuddered, and the guttural growl of something massive echoed through the stillness. The bear struck again, its claws raking deep into the doorframe. The force shook the hinges until the wood burst into jagged fragments. A 900-pound Kodiak forced its way through, eyes locked on the scent of food and human presence. Ethan scrambled in panic, but Ryan's instincts took hold. With no thought for his own safety, he shoved his son behind a heavy table near the far wall, shielding him from view. The bear roared, swinging with its paw. Its claws ripped across Ryan's shoulder and forearm, shredding his jacket and flesh in one violent strike. Blood ran freely, but adrenaline pushed him forward. The cabin shook as the animal advanced, smashing furniture and scattering supplies across the floor. With his arm torn and pain blazing through his body, Ryan staggered toward a side shelf where his revolver rested. His fingers closed around the grip of the .44 Magnum, the weight of the weapon a fragile barrier between survival and destruction. The first shot cracked inside the small cabin, deafening and sharp. The muzzle flash lit the walls for a heartbeat. The bear hesitated but did not flee. It circled, pacing, its growls filling the air before lunging again. Another shot rang out, echoing into the forest. The standoff had begun, a desperate fight between human determination and raw power. The second shot echoed off the cabin walls and into the trees, leaving only the ringing of spent gunfire and the ragged sound of breathing. Smoke drifted in the air as the bear stumbled, its massive body brushing against the broken frame of the doorway. It growled low, shaking its head before retreating a few steps. Ryan steadied himself, the revolver gripped tightly in his bloodied hand, though his strength was fading. He could feel warm streams running down his arm, each heartbeat pushing the pain deeper into his bones. Ethan remained hidden behind the table, frozen in silence, his wide eyes locked on his father. The animal hesitated near the doorway, pacing back and forth with a fury that filled the cabin. For a terrifying moment, it seemed ready to strike again. Then, with a sudden roar, it turned and lumbered back onto the ruined porch. Boards cracked beneath its weight, nails popped free, and the once sturdy entrance sagged under the damage. The bear moved toward the tree line, glancing back only once before vanishing into the thick forest. Silence fell, heavy and suffocating, broken only by Ryan's shallow breaths and the creak of shattered wood. Ryan collapsed onto the floor, his body trembling from shock and exhaustion. He pressed his good hand against the wounds on his shoulder, trying to slow the bleeding. Every movement was agony, but he forced himself to stay conscious. Ethan crawled out from his hiding place, his small hands shaking as he tried to help his father sit upright. The boy's face was pale, but his presence alone gave Ryan the will to keep fighting through the pain. When dawn finally broke, the cabin stood in ruin. The porch was destroyed, the door hung from twisted hinges, and claw marks ran deep across the walls. Supplies lay scattered across the floor, some crushed beyond use, others torn open. Blood marked the wooden planks, mingling with splinters and broken furniture. The small shelter that had once felt like safety now carried the scars of a night unlike any they had endured. Hours later, a group of guides from a nearby camp arrived after hearing the shots. They found Ryan leaning weakly against the table, pale but alive, while Ethan stood guard with his father's empty revolver clutched in both hands. The sight of the wreckage told the story clearly. They had faced one of the largest predators on the island in the most dangerous way possible, within the walls of a cabin too small to offer real protection. Ryan was rushed to a medical outpost where doctors treated deep cuts and torn muscles. Surgery was required to repair his arm, and weeks of recovery lay ahead. Though his body would bear the scars for the rest of his life, his actions that night ensured his son survived unharmed. For the guides who examined the scene, it was proof of how quickly danger could invade even the most prepared camp. News of the attack spread quickly across Kodiak. Officials warned that cabins, no matter how solid, could never be considered true barriers when hunger drove a bear to strike. The story became a stark reminder to all who lived and worked in the wild that protection often came not from walls, but from vigilance and readiness. Ryan's stand was remembered not only as survival, but as a father's instinct to protect, no matter the cost. In late September 2025, the cool winds of Wyoming carried across the valleys and ridges where hunters often tested both skill and patience. Mark Taylor, a seasoned outdoorsman with decades of experience in the backcountry, set out that season with his longtime companion David. Both men had traveled many miles into a rugged valley known for its large bison herds. Their goal was to use a careful stalk from the high ground, where rocks and brush could provide cover while they closed the distance. Each carried a .45, 70 rifle built for power against the heaviest animals in North America. Layered camouflage and gaiters protected them from both weather and terrain, while glassing scopes gave them the vision needed to study movement far below. From the ridge, they could see a group of massive bulls near a bend in the river. The animals, each weighing close to 900 kilograms, grazed slowly while keeping wary eyes on the surroundings. Mark studied them through binoculars, watching how the wind shifted and gave subtle hand signals to his partner. Step by step, they moved closer, advancing only when the breeze masked their scent. Years of experience had taught them that the difference between success and disaster often came down to reading the smallest details in silence. The pair slipped into range, crouching low behind rock outcrops and sagebrush. At just 40 yards, the tension of the stalk reached its peak. Suddenly, one of the dominant bulls raised its massive head, nostrils flaring as it sensed something unnatural nearby. The animal's dark eyes locked in their direction, and in an instant, the peaceful valley erupted into chaos. The bull charged. Its hooves pounded the ground like rolling thunder, breaking branches and tearing through underbrush. Mark braced himself and lifted his rifle, squeezing off a round into the massive shoulder. The slug struck, but the bull's momentum did not falter. It crashed into him with bone-crushing force, throwing his body across jagged rocks. The impact drove the air from his lungs as he hit hard against a fallen log, ribs snapping under the pressure. Pinned against the wood, Mark struggled to remain conscious. Pain surged through his chest, and blood seeped through torn layers of clothing where sharp edges had opened his skin. The bull swung its horns, kicking dirt and dust into the air, pressing forward with sheer strength. David acted with desperate speed, raising his rifle and firing again and again. The cracks echoed off the cliffs, each shot striking heavy muscle but only slowing the enraged animal after several hits. At last, the massive body staggered, veering away from the downed hunter. Its charge broke, and it retreated toward the herd, leaving shattered brush and churned earth behind. Mark, battered and bloodied, clawed his way back from the log, gasping for air with every painful breath. The danger had passed for the moment, But the valley floor bore the marks of violence that could erupt in seconds when instinct and power clashed on open ground. Mark's chest heaved as he forced himself away from the shattered log, every movement sending sharp waves of pain through his ribs. His hands shook as he tried to steady himself on the uneven ground, blood darkening the rocky soil beneath him. His body bore cuts from stone and horn, and each breath came shallow, rasping as if the weight of the valley air pressed harder on him than ever before. David hurried to his side, his rifle still warm, eyes locked on the retreating bison as it limped toward the rest of the herd near the river. The giant beast had not fallen, but had pulled back enough to leave them alive. For long minutes, the two hunters remained still, listening for the sound of another charge. Dust and broken brush hung heavy in the valley air, carrying the smell of sweat, iron, and spent powder. The silence felt unnatural after the chaos, but it gave Mark a chance to cling to consciousness. He pressed a hand to his chest where the impact had left his ribs shattered, and his breathing labored. Bruises were already forming across his side, and his face carried the pale look of a man close to collapse. David helped Mark to his knees, then slowly upright, though the effort caused Mark to nearly buckle again. They moved step by painful step toward higher ground where they could gather themselves. The ridge that once gave them an advantage now felt like an escape route, a place of safety above the valley where the herd still grazed. Each footfall left streaks of blood on the dirt, a trail marking the cost of their encounter. As they reached a slope dotted with pine, David forced Mark to rest against a boulder. There he tore strips from his own shirt and bound the worst of the gashes, slowing the bleeding as best he could. The makeshift bandages soaked quickly, but they gave Mark a chance to recover from the edge of unconsciousness. His breaths remained uneven, each inhalation shallow and tight, but the fact that he was still able to stay awake was enough to keep David working with urgency. When the sun rose fully over the valley, the quiet returned, as if nothing had happened. The herd moved slowly along the river, calm once more, while the two men sat far above on the ridge, staring down at the place where the ground still bore the marks of violence. For David, the sight was a reminder of how close the line between skill and disaster truly was. For Mark, the pain in his ribs and the throbbing in his side would serve as a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life. Later that day, they managed to signal to a guide who was traveling with another group not far from the valley. Help arrived, and Mark was carried out with great effort, his body battered but alive. Surgery would be required to repair his broken ribs and treat the torn muscles, but doctors later confirmed he was fortunate to have survived at all. News of the encounter spread quickly among other hunters, carried through camps and guide stations across the region. The story became a warning, a reminder that even experienced men using every precaution could still face sudden violence when approaching such powerful animals. Guides emphasized once more that reading the wind, knowing escape routes, and staying vigilant at all times were not simply skills but lifelines. For Mark and David, the ridge that had once promised success would always be remembered as the place where instinct and survival clashed. The cost was pain, scars, and memories that would never fade. But the outcome was a life preserved against odds that so easily could have ended in silence. In early October 2022, the valleys of remote Montana were filled with heavy fog that rolled down from the ridges and blanketed the ground in a pale white sheet. Visibility was cut to barely 20 yards, and every sound seemed muffled by the damp air. On that cold morning, Jake Miller and his partner Ben had already harvested a mature bull elk near a narrow creek. The two men, both experienced hunters, had set to work skinning the animal, their layered camouflage clothing damp with mist and sweat. They had prepared carefully for the season, using scent-blocking spray and carrying rifles suited for large game, Jake with a .30 06 and Ben with a .300 Winchester Magnum, each round chosen for precision and power. The elk lay stretched across the wet grass, its size making the task long and difficult. As they worked, the sharp metallic smell of fresh blood filled the air and drifted into the surrounding timber. What the hunters could not see through the thick veil of fog was that the same smell carried beyond the creek, drawing the attention of something far more dangerous than another elk. The forest fell eerily quiet, the kind of silence that unsettles even the most seasoned outdoorsman. Without warning, a massive black bear appeared, stepping out of the mist like a shadow taking form. Its movements were silent, deliberate, and its dark coat blended with the fog-draped trees. In an instant, the animal shifted from stalking to charging, closing the distance with shocking speed. Jake had only seconds to react. He shouldered his rifle and fired, the crack of the .3006 shattering the stillness. The bullet struck the bear in the shoulder, but the shot did not stop its advance. The impact slowed it only for a heartbeat before the beast crashed into him with the full weight of muscle and rage. The force knocked him backward, throwing his body into the damp earth. Claws raked across his arm and chest, tearing through fabric and flesh in brutal swipes. Pain seared through him, sharp and immediate, as warm blood soaked his jacket. The black bear loomed over him, its teeth bared, the sound of its growl vibrating through the fog like a rolling drum. Ben, only a few yards away, raised his rifle with trembling speed. The .300 Win Mag thundered at close range, the recoil jolting him as the slug slammed into the animal. The bear staggered, shook its massive head, and roared in fury. Another step forward, then another round from Ben's rifle at point-blank range. This time the animal turned, staggering toward the trees, its hulking body fading back into the fog from where it had first emerged. Jake, bloodied and gasping, crawled away from the site of the struggle, his body weak from pain and shock. His breath came fast, his vision blurred, and the sound of the creek nearby mixed with the echoes of the retreating bear. The elk lay forgotten, its harvest now a lure that had almost cost both men their lives. Jake's arms trembled as he pulled himself farther from the bloody grass, each movement leaving streaks of red against the fog-damp ground. His chest burned where the claws had torn deep and his jacket hung in shredded tatters. Ben knelt beside him, eyes darting toward the tree line where the shape of the retreating bear had dissolved into the fog. The forest seemed to breathe around them, the mist curling over the creek as though hiding whatever still lingered out there. Both men knew the danger was not gone, only delayed. Ben bound Jake's arm with a strip of fabric ripped from his own gear, tying it tight to slow the bleeding. Jake's breath came in short bursts, his ribs aching from the violent impact. Every sound in the fog seemed louder now, the gurgle of the stream, the flap of wings from crows in the distance, and the hollow echoes of dripping water on leaves. It all carried the weight of uncertainty, a reminder that another charge could come without warning. They knew they had to leave. The elk, once a hard-earned prize, now lay abandoned beside the creek, its scent only an invitation for more predators. With every ounce of strength, Jake dragged himself upright with Ben's support, leaning heavily on his partner. Their rifles, once tools of the hunt, now felt like lifelines as they stumbled toward higher ground away from the thick timber. The fog followed them like a shroud, limiting sight to only a few steps ahead. Each movement was a struggle for Jake, who clenched his jaw against the pain tearing through his chest and arm. The path was uneven, slick with wet leaves and loose stones, and more than once he nearly collapsed. Ben steadied him, the weight of his friend heavy across his shoulders, determined not to leave him behind. After what felt like hours but was only minutes, they reached the edge of a clearing where the mist began to thin. From there, they found the faint outline of a game trail leading back toward camp. Ben paused often, listening for the heavy footfalls or guttural growls that might signal the bear's return, but the only sound was Jake's ragged breathing. When they finally reached their camp, other hunters rushed to help. Makeshift bandages were replaced with cleaner cloth, water was boiled, and Jake was laid on a blanket near the fire. His wounds were serious, his body weakened, but he was alive. By the time a vehicle carried him to the nearest town for medical care, the sun had burned away the last of the morning fog, revealing the valley below where the creek still flowed past the site of the attack. News of the ambush spread quickly among the local hunting community. Guides spoke of it as a sharp reminder that dense fog could hide not only the landscape but also the threats that lurked within it. They warned that field dressing big game in poor visibility was among the most dangerous tasks in bear country. For Jake, the scars would remain for life, carved into his skin as proof of the morning when the mist turned a simple hunt into a desperate fight for survival. For Ben, the memory of firing close-range shots in the gray haze while his friend bled at his feet would forever mark the fine line between skill, luck, and survival in the wild. In late September 2024, the forests of Ussuri-Krai in the Russian Far East were wrapped in a cool mist as autumn pushed closer to winter. Rivers cut sharply through the land, and the banks were lined with thick brush where animals hid and moved unseen. On that day, Viktor Petrov and Sergei Ivanov, both seasoned hunters with many years of experience, were deep in this wilderness. They had come prepared for the challenge, carrying heavy rifles, wearing layered camouflage clothing, and using their knowledge of animal tracks to follow a massive Russian grizzly that had been moving along a remote waterway. Victor, who carried a .375 H&H, led the way. He was known for his confidence and steady aim, traits that had earned him respect in hunting camps across the region. Sergei, following a short distance away on the opposite bank of the river, trusted Victor's instincts as they tracked fresh paw prints pressed into the mud. The smell of damp earth and the rush of shallow water filled the air as they moved closer to a wide bend where the track seemed fresh. Victor waded into the river, his boots sinking into the soft ground beneath the surface. He leaned forward, scanning the thickets on the far edge. The fog hanging low over the valley dulled every sound, making it harder to sense danger until it was almost too late. In the stillness, a sudden crash of branches erupted from the dense cover. From the brush came a massive grizzly, weighing close to 600 kilograms. The animal burst forward with terrifying speed, its muscles rippling as it splashed through the water. Victor tried to lift his rifle, but the slippery ground beneath his feet betrayed him. His boots slid, his body tilted, and the second he needed to steady himself was gone. The bear crashed into him with brutal force, knocking him backward. Water splashed high as Victor was shoved against a submerged log. The rifle slipped from his grasp as he struggled, pinned beneath the weight of the furious animal. Its claws and mass pressed him down, holding him below the surface where the current pressed against his chest. Across the river, Sergei froze for a heartbeat before lifting his rifle. He shouted, his voice lost in the noise of the water and the roar of the bear. He fired warning shots, the crack echoing against the valley walls, but the animal did not move away. The distance and the river between them made it impossible for him to help. Victor thrashed beneath the water, bubbles rising to the surface as he fought desperately against the crushing weight. His arms flailed, then weakened as the seconds stretched into a terrible eternity. Sergei's shouts grew hoarse, his shots echoing again and again, but he could only watch in horror as the bear held its ground. By the time the animal pulled back into the brush, leaving as suddenly as it had appeared, the water was still, and Victor no longer moved. The attack was over in moments, but its weight would never leave Sergei's memory. Sergei stood frozen on the riverbank, his rifle hanging limp in his hands, the smoke from his last round drifting upward into the cool September air. The water settled slowly, ripples spreading from where Victor had struggled moments before. The log that had trapped him remained half submerged, a grim marker of the spot where everything had ended. Sergei's breath came heavy, his chest tightening as the silence returned to the valley. The grizzly was gone, but its presence lingered like a shadow over the place. His legs felt weak as he crossed upstream to where the water shallowed, moving as quickly as the slippery stones would allow. When he reached Victor, the weight of grief fell upon him. The man who had led so many hunts, who had taught him patience and discipline in the wild, now lay still. Sergei knelt in the shallows, the cold water biting against his boots, and for the first time in years, he felt powerless. The wilderness that had once felt like a place of purpose and strength now seemed hostile and cruel. He stared into the thick brush where the bear had vanished, half expecting it to return. Every sound of shifting branches or rustling leaves sent a jolt of fear through him. Yet there was only the steady rush of the river and the beating of his own heart. He knew he had to leave, but moving Victor's body alone was impossible. Sergei covered him as best he could with his jacket, then began the long and lonely walk back toward the nearest settlement. Each step felt heavier than the last, his mind replaying the scene again and again, the splash of water, the crushing weight, the desperate struggle that had ended too quickly. By the time he reached help, the news spread quickly. Local hunters and officials returned with him to recover Victor, carrying him carefully from the river where his final hunt had ended. The group moved in silence, their faces grim, for each of them understood that what had happened could just as easily have claimed their own lives. In the days after, news of the tragedy spread beyond the small community. Authorities warned of the risks along river corridors where footing is treacherous and escape is limited. Despite Victor's experience, rifle, and instincts, one slip on wet ground proved fatal. Experts noted that Russian grizzlies grow especially unpredictable in autumn as they fight for food before winter. For Sergei, the lessons carried a sharper edge. He could not sleep without hearing the crash of branches or seeing the spray of water. He avoided the riverbanks where he and Victor had once hunted together. The land he had loved for decades now seemed like a place of ghosts, where every shadow might hide the same fate that had claimed his friend. The Ussuri cry remained wild, untamed, and unforgiving. The river kept flowing, the forest kept growing, and the animals kept moving through the brush, unaware of the sorrow left behind. For those who entered its depths, the memory of Victor's last stand served as a warning that even the strongest and most skilled were never beyond the reach of nature's power. In early November 2023, the far northern reaches of Quebec were locked in the grip of winter, the land coated in snow and the lake sealed by a thin shell of ice. On one of these frozen waters, hunter Mark Lefebvre moved slowly, tracking the marks of a massive bull moose. He had risen before daylight, pulling on insulated layers to guard against the cold and carrying his .300 Win Mag rifle fitted with soft point rounds. For hours he had scanned ridge lines with glassing scopes, pausing often to study the edges of the forest where shadows stretched long across the ice. Mark, who grew up hunting in Quebec, knew the land well but also its risks. On that sharp, unsteady day, he angled with the wind to mask his scent. At last he spotted the moose, broad-antlered and massive, then dropped low, crawling through the snow to stay hidden. As he neared the animal, the ice beneath its heavy legs let out a sharp crack that echoed across the lake. The sound startled the bull, which lifted its head and swung it violently before breaking into a sudden charge. The air filled with the thunder of hooves on brittle ice, each step shaking the frozen sheet beneath its enormous weight. Mark, only 35 yards away, had seconds to react. He raised his rifle, aimed at the shoulder, and fired. The shot struck, but the impact did not stop the bull's momentum. It barreled closer, eyes wide, steam rising from its nostrils in the frigid air. Then the ice gave way beneath it with a violent split, and the beast plunged partway into the freezing water. The surface shattered in jagged shards around the animal as it flailed, its weight dragging sections of ice down with it. Mark stumbled back, but the sudden collapse pulled him toward the hole as well. His boots slipped on the slick surface, and icy water rushed up over his legs as he scrambled to keep his balance. The freezing shock numbed his body instantly, stiffening his fingers even as he fought to push himself backward. The bull thrashed wildly, its antlers smashing against ice sheets, sending shards flying. Water surged outward, and the frozen edges groaned under the strain. Mark's ankle twisted painfully as he slipped, his body crashing down hard. He dragged himself on hands and knees across the fragile surface, bruises spreading across his side and shoulders as he fought to get away from the chaos. His rifle lay near the hole, half submerged and useless. The only thought in his mind was survival, every instinct screaming at him to escape the freezing grip of the lake. His hands, raw and stiff from the icy water, clawed desperately at the snow-covered edge until at last he pulled himself farther away from the collapsing section. Behind him, the bull continued to struggle, half in water and half on ice, its power unchecked by the injury from the shot. The clash of hooves, antlers, and cracking ice filled the valley, a storm of noise and fury on that frozen morning. Mark lay on the ice, his chest heaving, the cold air burning his lungs as he tried to steady himself. Every muscle ached from the fall, and his ankle throbbed sharply whenever he shifted his weight. Behind him, the bull continued to thrash in the jagged opening, each violent movement sending fresh cracks through the surrounding surface. For several tense minutes, the scene was nothing but noise and chaos, the crash of hooves against ice mixing with the groans of shifting slabs. Slowly, the animal's struggles grew weaker, its energy drained by the freezing water and its own bulk. At last, the sound quieted, replaced by the faint creak of the frozen lake settling again. Mark did not move for a long time, afraid that even a small shift might send him crashing into the water beside the moose. The icy spray had soaked through his gloves, and his fingers had grown stiff and pale. He pressed them against his body, trying to regain a trace of warmth while forcing himself to think clearly. With great effort, Mark pushed up onto his knees and crawled across the ice, testing each section before placing his weight upon it. Every yard felt like a mile, the fear of falling back into the freezing water clawing at his thoughts. At last, he reached firmer ground near the snowy shoreline. He collapsed against a patch of frozen reeds, exhausted but alive. The rifle he had dropped lay far behind, near the broken edge, out of reach. His body was battered, his ankles swollen, and his hands numb with frostbite. But he had survived what could have been his final hunt. The stillness of the forest seemed almost cruel in its silence, as if the land itself had already moved on from the violence. Mark knew he had to leave the area quickly before his strength faded. He rose slowly, favoring his injured leg, and began the painful trek back toward camp. Each step was marked by sharp jolts of pain in his ankle and the stiffness in his bruised ribs, but the thought of shelter and fire kept him moving. When he finally stumbled into camp hours later, guides rushed to his aid. They wrapped him in blankets, tended to his frostbitten hands, and supported him as he collapsed near the fire. His story spread quickly among the group, each listener shaken by the details. The image of a massive moose crashing through fragile ice and nearly dragging a man to his death lingered in their minds. In the days that followed, Mark's injuries were treated. The bruises across his ribs and arms faded slowly, while his ankle remained swollen and sore. His hands bore the marks of frostbite, a constant reminder of how quickly cold could turn against even the most prepared hunter. Local officials who heard of the event used it as a warning. They reminded others that moose, though often overlooked compared to bears or wolves, were unpredictable and deadly when startled. They also emphasized that frozen lakes were never truly safe in early winter, no matter how solid they appeared. For Mark, the lesson was personal and permanent. He had come close to losing everything, not only to the charge of a bull, but to the betrayal of ice beneath his feet. The memory of that morning would stay with him forever, a reminder that in the wild, danger hides in every sound, every surface, and every step. In late September 2025, the vast wilderness of the Yukon was painted with the colors of autumn, the hills glowing gold and red while cold winds swept through the valleys. Hunter Daniel Harris had set out during caribou season carrying a .270 rifle and moving carefully along a narrow ridge. He wore heavy layers to block the chill, his pack loaded with supplies, and his eyes focused on the ridgelines where herds sometimes passed. Hours of tracking had tested his patience, but he pressed on, determined to make the most of the fading daylight. The land was rugged, with roots and rocks hidden under fallen leaves, and as Daniel shifted his weight along the slope, his boot caught on a twisted root. He fell hard, the sharp snap of bone in his ankle followed by a searing pain that shot up his leg. His arm scraped against jagged stone, leaving long cuts that bled freely. The shock left him gasping, the cold ground pressing against his body as he tried to gather his strength. Unable to stand, Daniel dragged himself toward a nearby fallen log, his movements slow and clumsy as his injured leg refused to bear weight. He pulled himself behind the trunk, pressing against the rough bark, his breath shallow as he tried to remain unseen. The forest around him was eerily quiet, save for the rustling of leaves and the faint call of distant birds. As the sun dipped lower, shadows stretched across the valley, and twilight deepened into a thickening gloom. Then came the sound that froze his blood, the long, rising howl of wolves echoing through the hills. Another answered, closer this time, and soon the voices blended into a haunting chorus that surrounded the ridge. Daniel stayed still, his camo clothing blending into the ground, but the metallic scent of blood from his wounds carried through the air. Minutes passed like hours before the first low growls cut through the silence. From the brush ahead, pale eyes glowed, catching the last light of day. A pack of wolves emerged, their lean bodies moving in fluid silence, their noses twitching as they caught his scent. One wolf lunged first, teeth flashing as it snapped at his shoulder. The impact sent him rolling against the log, pain exploding from the bite. Two others circled, their bodies low to the ground, growls rumbling deep from their chests. Daniel, driven by sheer instinct, raised his rifle with trembling hands and fired at point-blank range. The shot tore through the nearest animal, its body collapsing into the leaves. But the recoil sent fresh agony through his injured arm. The others hesitated, startled by the blast, before darting back a few paces. Their snarls cut through the fading light, their eyes never leaving him. His heart pounded as he fumbled at his belt, his fingers closing around the cold metal of a flare. With a swift motion, he fired it upward, the sudden burst of light and sound cutting through the darkness. The wolves shrank back into the shadows, but their shapes lingered at the edges of the trees, waiting, watching, unwilling to surrender their claim to easy prey. Daniel knew the danger was far from over. The flare hissed into the dark sky, casting sparks that lit the clearing for only a few seconds before fading into smoke. The wolves backed away, their eyes glowing from the tree line, but their low growls never stopped. Daniel clutched the rifle against his chest, every muscle shaking from cold, pain, and fear. His shoulder burned where the teeth had torn through flesh, and blood still dripped slowly onto the ground. The weight of exhaustion pressed on him, yet he forced himself to think of a way forward. Knowing he could not stay hidden, Daniel dragged himself from the log toward the faint sound of running water. Each movement was slow and agonizing, his broken ankle scraping the ground as his arms did most of the work. The wolves tracked him from a distance, shadows slipping in and out of the brush, their hunger battling their caution. The flare had bought him time, but he knew it would not last. At last he reached the creek. The icy water numbed his hands as he snapped branches from nearby shrubs. Using strips torn from his shirt, he bound them tightly around his leg, fashioning a crude splint to keep the ankle from bending. The cold water slowed the bleeding from his wounds, but the shaking in his body warned him he was losing strength. Night closed in fully, the forest silent except for the rustle of paws circling just out of sight. Daniel lay close to the water, clutching the rifle and waiting for the next rush. Hours stretched painfully as the pack lingered but did not attack again. The smell of smoke and the echo of the flare still unsettled them, keeping them wary. Near dawn, the sound of rotor blades broke through the silence. A rescue helicopter, drawn by his emergency beacon, hovered overhead. The sight of the machine scattered the wolves at last, sending them slipping back into the forest. Rescuers lifted Daniel from the ground, his body battered, his face pale from blood loss and shock. He survived the night, but the memory of glowing eyes in the dark and the sound of teeth sinking into his shoulder would follow him forever. The Yukon had shown him its harshest side, and he carried its mark long after the wounds healed.